They stereotype if you're a Norwegian black metal band, oh, you're bad, you hurt people, and you burn churches and all that stuff.
You know, we hurt people with our music. That's what we do, you know.
Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Caleb Likes Metal. Today we've got a Discog Dive, a segment where I discuss a band's full discography in release order and give my thoughts on the band as a whole. Today we have one of the biggest bands in black metal, and the band which is my personal gateway into the genre, Immortal. Immortal is one of my favorite bands of all time, and is also the band that helped me get into black metal in around 2016 with their song All Shall Fall, and later the album of the same name, before I dove into their earlier work. I've listened to all of the band's albums at least a couple times in the past, but this was actually the first time in years that I've listened to most of them in their entirety. I have to say, it's been a delight revisiting these albums, and I thoroughly enjoyed the vast majority of them. In what I think will be a fairly rare case for the series, I'm also going to be talking about the other bands attached to Immortal in addition to Immortal itself. These include the supergroup I, as well as the solo projects for band members Abbath and Demonaz. Not only were multiple members of Immortal involved in these projects, especially two original members who are both core to Immortal songwriting, but I also think they'll make for a more well-rounded and inclusive retrospective. Another quick note before we begin. I'll be referring to the various band members by their stage names rather than their legal names, since those are the names they presented themselves with during their time in Immortal. The story of Immortal begins back in the early 1990s in Bergen, Norway. Having been in some bands with one another in the past several years, bassist and vocalist Abbath, guitarist Demonaz, and drummer Armageddon would found Immortal alongside guitarist Jorn Tunsberg, who would leave shortly after the band's formation. Immortal would record some music together and release a couple of smaller releases and demos in 1991, before recording and releasing their debut studio album in 1992. There are a number of things Diabolical, Fullmoon, Mysticism is notable for. First of all, in terms of visual presentation, it marks the beginning of Immortal's long tradition of using photographs of the band members as album artwork, which would go on to feature on the majority of their albums. Sonically, this album is quite notable in the context of its genre. Immortal were one of the pioneers of second-wave black metal alongside other notable Norwegian bands like Mayhem, Burzum, Gorgoroth, and Dark Throne, to name a few. While they were a part of this Norwegian black metal scene, and this album certainly does showcase many aspects of that style, its sound is actually quite unique compared to Immortal's contemporaries at the time. The songwriting is fairly reminiscent of other second-wave bands, but the production is extremely different. Most other big Norwegian black metal bands at the time used production that was very lo-fi and abrasive, often featuring minimal bass and using guitar tones that sounded extremely loud and buzzy. Diabolical Fullmoon Mysticism, on the other hand, has a sound that is nowhere near as abrasive, and while it is still raw sounding, has a more deep, low, almost muted sound to it. It really makes the album stand out among its contemporaries. In terms of songwriting, this album tends to be fairly mid-paced, less aggressive than its contemporaries, and features few of the genre's trademark blast beats. I think these features, in addition to the less abrasive production, actually make this a relatively accessible album for black metal. Granted, it is still black metal, so it's not exactly going to have the typical non-metalhead falling in love with it. To me, this album comes across as fairly atmospheric and really gets across the cold, wintry feeling that Immortal's work often tries to evoke. All of these aspects, and the sound of this album in general, really give it a feeling of uniqueness in the band's discography. This aspect is something that I think the band would really succeed with throughout their career, as I think almost all their albums have unique qualities that set them apart from the rest. I would consider this album to be a really solid debut full-length. It's not one of the best I'll be covering in this video in my opinion, but still very good. And honestly, I would say I thoroughly enjoy most of the albums I'll be talking about here, so it being a weaker one isn't saying much. There are some absolutely classic Immortal songs here, like the opener, The Call of the Winter Moon, one of the faster and more aggressive songs here, or Cold Winds of Funeral Dust, which goes at a more mid-pace. I really like Abbath's vocals on this album, which sound more like the usual black metal shrieks than his more croak-like vocals that would come to characterize later Immortal albums. I don't have a huge amount to say about this one since it has always been an album I go back to less than others, but it is an overall solid, enjoyable, and undeniably classic debut. Next we come to Pure Holocaust, released a year later in 1993. This album would bring with it some changes to the lineup in regards to the drummer. Bassist and vocalist Abbath actually performed the drums on this album, although drums are credited to the band's official drummer at the time, Grimm, who also appears on the album cover. This album immediately sets itself apart from Diabolical, Fullmoon, Mysticism in many ways. The production style is entirely different, with the guitars having a much sharper presence and sounding more like the buzzsaw guitars you'd commonly hear in black metal at the time. This album is much harsher and more abrasive than their debut in terms of production, as well as much more aggressive in its songwriting. Pure Holocaust is full of fast tremolo riffs and blast beats, overall featuring a much faster, heavier, and more threatening sound than their first album. Despite its harshness, I actually prefer the sound of this album, since I think it not only fits the songwriting style, but it also gives the album a really unique and strong character. In terms of the songs themselves, I think all of them are very strong. This album is full of great black metal riffs, with some of my favorites showing up in songs like A Sign for the Norse Hordes to Ride, The Sun No Longer Rises, and As the Eternity Opens. I especially love some of the more melodic sections which begin and end The Sun No Longer Rises, while opener Unsilent Storms in the North Abyss carries a sense of foreboding. My only real complaint about these songs in general is that many of them end very abruptly, often feeling more like the recording is just cut off rather than having a natural end to the song. I guess it fits the harsh vibe of the album, but I don't particularly like it. Overall though, I think this album definitely surpasses Immortal's debut and has always been one of my personal favorites in their discography. Immortal would take a longer break between albums before their next release, which would come in 1995, Battles in the North. This album would feature only Abbath and Demonaz once again, and would be Abbath's final performance on drums for Immortal, before they would be joined by an official, long-time drummer on their next album. To be honest, this is one of only a couple Immortal albums I've never cared for all that much, and the re-listen I did to prepare for this retrospective solidified that for me. In fact, this is probably the only album I'll be discussing in this video that I don't like that much, and otherwise I think the Abbath and Demonaz duo have written almost nothing but excellent music, both together in Immortal and individually. Battles in the North, despite my mixed feelings, does set itself apart from the previous Immortal albums in some ways. The production style is very different, coming across to me as a much more reminiscent of the usual lo-fi black metal style of the early Norwegian bands than their first two albums, which were lo-fi in their own way, but not quite in this way. Stylistically, this album is more similar to Pure Holocaust than Diabolical, Fullmoon, Mysticism in my opinion, with fast tremolo riffs and lots of blast beats. That said, I do think this one is a little more varied than those two prior albums, which is a point in its favor. I do enjoy a couple songs on here like the title track, Cursed Realms of the Winter Demons, or Descent into Eminent Silence, and really the songs themselves here aren't terrible. However, there is a reason I don't care for this album, and that almost entirely comes down to the production. It is very, very black metal, but to a point that I don't think really works. The drums and vocals are very high in the mix, and while the guitars aren't inaudible, they aren't as prevalent as I'd like them to be. On top of that, the instruments here sound a bit muddy at times in terms of production, and even Abbath's playing of the drums on this one feels less clean than on prior albums. It's not a bad album exactly, but if there's anything throughout Immortal's discography that I'm less likely to return to, it is this album. Now we complete what I'd consider to be Immortal's classic era with 1997's Blizzard Beasts. Once again, this album is notable for some lineup-related reasons. It is the first Immortal album to feature longtime drummer Horg, who would remain in the band for over 2 decades, and is also the last one for almost as long to prominently feature contributions from Demonaz outside of lyrics. This album is also quite notable for being a shift musically as well. It's the shortest Immortal album by several minutes, coming in at under 29 minutes in length, with over half the album being made up of songs under 3 minutes long. This album is also sometimes credited with showing a shift towards a more thrash metal influenced style, which isn't quite as prominent here as it will become on later Immortal albums, but is still noticeable. Much like Battles in the North, this is one of the few Immortal albums I'd never cared for in the past, but this re-listen did help me to appreciate it more, though it's still one of my least favorites. The title track is a solid opener that shows a lot of Immortal's usual qualities and sets the tone well for the album to come, and the following tracks, Nebular Ravenswinter and Suns That Sank Below, are also really solid. You also got the one epic song on the album, Mountains of Might, which comes in at over 6 minutes long and is something of a fan favorite from what I've seen. Once again, the production is mostly what hurts this one for me. It's not as unbalanced and muddy as Battles in the North, but still lacks the strong identity and unique sound of Immortal's first 2 albums. To me, this one feels a bit flat. Still, it is a solid and enjoyable album, even though I think the albums that would follow it would be a significant improvement. In 1999, the world would be blessed with what I would consider not just Immortal's best album, but one of my favorite albums of all time, At the Heart of Winter. Once again, we have a lineup change with this one, with Abbath and Horg being the only members to record the album, while Demonaz still contributed lyrics because he had to leave the band. On top of that, the artwork of this album is also very notable, as it's the first Immortal album with their current logo, and also the first of their albums not to feature the band members on the cover. Because of the fact that this is Immortal's first album to be written entirely by Abbath, there's a noticeable shift in the band's sound and compositions here. At the Heart of Winter is, unlike previous albums, made up entirely of lengthy epics, with the majority of the 6 songs coming in at around or over 8 minutes, and the shortest being 6. Not only are the songs now all much longer, but they are also significantly more melodic and progressive in their composition. While Immortal's previous albums are ones I generally consider to be pretty traditional Norwegian black metal, this album breaks from that mold with much more varied song structures and highly melodic riffs. On top of that, there's a large presence of synthesizers on this album that really contribute to its feeling of epicness and atmosphere, which also help to set this album apart. All in all, it's easily the most unique album up to this point in Immortal's discography. I absolutely love every single song here. Opener with Stand the Fall of Time is a classic black metal track with its iconic opening riff, fast verses, and highly melodic sections. Solar Fall has always also been a favorite of mine with some unique and catchy riffs. Title track At the Heart of Winter is probably a close second favorite song on the album for me, behind the opener, with a very atmospheric synthesizer opening and some very melodic and memorable riffs. The middle tracks, Where Dark and Light Don't Differ and Tragedies Blow at Horizon, are also great, and album closer Years of Silent Sorrow is an epic end to the album. I don't think I could praise this album enough if I tried, and it is absolutely my favorite in the band's whole discography. Out of all the albums I'll be discussing in this retrospective, I think Damned in Black could very well be the one my opinion shifted most on after another listen. Back when I used to listen to Immortal constantly 5 or 6 years ago, I considered this one of my least favorite albums in their discography, probably only above Battles in the North and Blizzard Beasts. This seems to be a relatively common opinion among fans, but after this most recent listen, I actually think this may be Immortal's most underrated album. Despite only releasing a year after At the Heart of Winter, this album is once again a bit of a shift for the band's sound. It still carries the band's usual black metal sound with some of the increased melodic presence of the previous album, but now is much more influenced by thrash metal. I can understand why so many fans consider this one of their least favorite albums, given the pretty big shift from the fan favorite that is At the Heart of Winter, but I still think this sound really works and produces some excellent songs. You can really hear this shift immediately, with the album opener Triumph quickly showcasing thrashy riffs and fast blast beats. The intensity keeps up throughout the song and into Wrath from Above before shifting into Against the Tide, which feels a little more reminiscent of the previous album. My Dimension really shows the thrash metal influence strongly, with an extremely fast opening, although other parts of the song do slow down for a bit of variety. The darkness that embraces me is a personal favorite of mine, reminding me a bit of something like Solarfall from the previous album, and being a good mix of this album's heavier sound and At the Heart of Winter's melodic and atmospheric sound. The title track similarly is more melodic and is one of Immortal's best songs in my opinion, closing the album on an excellent note. I think this album really deserves some more attention, and while it does do things a little differently at times, it still has plenty of Immortal's signature identity within it. Alongside At the Heart of Winter, 2002's Sons of Northern Darkness seems to be the other big fan favorite in the Immortal fanbase. While this would fall a little more towards the middle of my personal ranking of the band's discography, it is still an excellent album, so I can see where the reputation comes from. Not only is it a really solid album overall, but it also features some absolute classics from Immortal. To me, this album feels like a mix of the band's previous two albums. It still has a lot of thrashy elements from Damned in Black, with the first half of this album feeling quite reminiscent of that one, while still feeling a little more true to Immortal's traditional sound. It also carries elements of At the Heart of Winter as well, particularly in terms of the melodic aspects, on top of the back half of the album being entirely made up of 7 and 8 minute long black metal epics that wouldn't feel out of place on that album. Like I mentioned earlier, this album has some real classics on it. Opening tracks One by One and Sons of Northern Darkness start the album with thrashy riffs and fast blast beats, really showcasing the black metal fury Immortal was known for around this time. The third song, Tyrants, is perhaps Immortal's biggest song to date, featuring a slower pace and repetitive yet catchy riffs. Later tracks on the album like Within the Dark Mind and Antarctica really capture a more epic feel, while the slower paced closer Beyond the North Waves ends the album on a really great note. Even if this isn't quite one of my personal favorite albums I'm covering in this video, it is still an excellent one that is well deserving of its reputation. After Sons of Northern Darkness, Immortal split up in 2003, which brings us to the first non-Immortal album I'll be covering in this video. In 2006, a new supergroup called I would release the album Between Two Worlds, with writing, guitar, and vocals provided by Abbath, with fellow black metal musicians Ice Dale and King of Hell on guitar and bass, alongside original Immortal drummer Armageddon and Immortal member Demonaz providing lyrics. Despite this band being made up of many prominent black metal musicians, it actually goes for a much more classic metal style than Abbath's work in Immortal. This album is typically classified under the genre black and roll, combining traditional classic rock and metal with black metal. Even though I think many albums I'm covering here have distinctive qualities, I think this stylistic approach makes this possibly the most unique album in this video. I don't think I'd ever listened to this album in its full entirety before preparing to make this video, so I have to say I was really impressed. I was familiar with some of the bigger hits off Between Two Worlds, but honestly the entire album's fantastic. This is probably the most fun album to listen to in this entire video, consistently providing extremely catchy riffs and generally very entertaining songs. There's also quite a nice variety here, with some more upbeat songs complemented by more mid-paced or slower songs, and the combination of black metal and classic metal makes for a very dynamic sound. Abbath's vocals have also been tweaked a bit for this album, coming off much less harsh and even a little bit melodic at times, but still feeling distinctly like Abbath. Coming off of Immortal, this album feels very familiar, but also very different. I thoroughly love just about every song on this album. The opener, The Storm I Ride, is an upbeat, catchy song that really showcases the black and roll combo better than almost any other song on the album in my opinion. The following tracks, Warriors and Between Two Worlds, are more mid-paced, falling a bit more on the black metal side, and actually feeling somewhat reminiscent of some material on Sons of Northern Darkness. Battles is probably the heaviest and fastest song on the album, while Mountains is another good blending of styles, as is Days of Northwind. Far Beyond the Quiet gives us the obligatory, long, epic song of the album, being a little slower and having a stronger sense of atmosphere. Album closer Cursed We Are bookends the album nicely by calling back to the style of The Storm I Ride, ending the album nicely. This is a truly excellent album and one I'd highly recommend to any Immortal fans who haven't heard it. Immortal would re-emerge in 2007 before releasing their long-awaited 8th album, All Shall Fall. This album once again featured Abbath and Horg on guitar and vocals and drums respectively, alongside new bassist Apollyon, who would make his first and only appearance on an Immortal album. This was actually the first album from Immortal I'd heard, and is the album that I generally consider to have gotten me into black metal. Even though I really grew to love it when I first got into it, with time I found I actually do prefer a lot of Immortal's other material, but this is by no means a bad album. This one picks right up where Sons of Northern Darkness left off, feeling very much like a natural progression of Immortal's sound. It includes all the elements one might expect from the band at this point in their career, from their pure black metal roots to the thrash-influenced sound of their later material. I think this album might blend and balance the band's evolved sound the best out of all their material up to this point. It manages to be varied while still feeling extremely cohesive. The album opener and title track, All Shall Fall, is one of Immortal's biggest songs, and with good reason. It's a bit less dynamic and progressive than something like the songs on At the Heart of Winter, but still carries the same larger-than-life and melodic tendencies of that album. The same could be said of track 6, Mount North. The Rise of Darkness and Hordes of War are a little faster paced, with the former almost feeling reminiscent of Abbath's modern solo material to me, while the latter is the thrashiest song on the album. Northern on Fire is a more mid-paced black metal song, and Arctic Swarm reminds me a bit of the less thrashy songs on Damned in Black. The album ends with a longer track that slows things down a little, Unearthly Kingdom, which is more reminiscent of the later tracks of the band's previous album. Overall, one of the band's weaker offerings in my opinion, but still very solid throughout, which I think just speaks to the quality of this band's discography. With Immortal back in full swing, the band would continue touring over the next several years. That brings us to 2011 to discuss the second non-Immortal album in this video, March of the Norse, the first and currently only album from Demonaz as a solo artist. In addition to Demonaz himself providing vocals and songwriting, in Slaves, Ice Dale performed guitar and bass, while the original drummer of Immortal, Armageddon, performed drums. The sound of this album, while still being black metal, is remarkably different from Immortal's previous work. March of the Norse leans much more toward Viking metal. While this genre's definition tends to be somewhat fluid, I do think it's an accurate description given the slower pace of the album and the lyrics, which predominantly reference things like gods and battles. Demonaz's vocal style here sets it apart as well, being somewhat less harsh and a little more melodic. On top of that, there are some actual clean vocals here, mostly used more in the background as choral type vocals. Songs here are really solid. The one downside to this album, and the reason I can't really talk much about the individual songs, is that they are all very similar. I don't know that I'd say it's quite to the point that if you've heard one, you've heard them all, but the repetition of the album is a negative even if the songs themselves are done well. While the riffs, drumming, and vocals are pretty samey, this even comes down to the compositions themselves. Most of the songs seem to be in the same key, and all of them seem to be using a 6/8 meter, with no real variation aside from the tempo of the songs. Like I said, this is still a very well done album, and I thoroughly enjoy listening to it, but I can't say it doesn't get repetitive. That said, I appreciate it for its unique aspects among the other albums I'm covering here. Now we move from one solo project to another, and this one requires a bit more backstory. Around 2014, the members of Immortal became involved in a trademark dispute concerning who owned the rights to Immortal. This led to founding member and face of the band, Abbath, leaving in 2015. As a result of this, Abbath would go on to recruit several other musicians to record an album and tour as a solo project. Drummer Creature, who had previously been in several other bands such as Benighted and Disavowed, and bassist King of Hell, who was a part of Abbath's black and roll band I and was best known as bass player for Gurgoroth and later Godseed. Alongside some other session musicians, these three would craft the first Abbath album, which released in 2016. Simply titled Abbath, this first solo album is a really interesting one to look at in my opinion. While it does have several recognizable qualities from Abbath's time in Immortal, there are many places in which it feels quite different. I would describe this album as feeling heavier and darker than most of Immortal's albums, and generally seems to be taking a slightly different approach than even what Abbath wrote for Immortal. There are quite a few standouts here for me. A couple songs feel quite reminiscent of older Immortal material. Ashes of the Damned comes across like something from pure Holocaust to me, while Count the Dead or Root of the Mountain feel more like Sons of Northern Darkness or maybe Owl Shall Fall, and Fenrir Hunts is more reminiscent of Damned in Black. On the other hand, you've got songs like To War or Winterbane, which are not only fantastic songs, but also feel like nothing Immortal ever did. On top of that, this album has the unique quality of including some covers, which never appeared on Immortal's albums. An excellent cover of Judas Priest's Riding on the Wind that feels like Abbath really channeled the black and roll style of Between Two Worlds, and a modern rendition of Nebular Raven's Winter from Immortal's Blizzard Beasts. Covers would become a recurring aspect of Abbath's solo albums, which I really enjoy. Overall, this is a fantastic first solo outing for Abbath, and even though it's unfortunate that he split from Immortal, it's good to know he could still craft excellent black metal. With Abbath's solo career well underway, it's time to take a look at what the new version of Immortal itself would look like. Since Abbath had been the frontman, vocal duties would now fall to Demonaz, who would make his grand return to Immortal with the band's first album in nearly a decade, Northern Chaos Gods. Joining him was longtime Immortal drummer Horg, making this duo the new face of Immortal. On a personal level, this is quite a special album for me, since it was the first album in this video I experienced the hype for. I began tipping my toes into black metal back around 2016 through Immortal, and eagerly awaited a new album. I still remember how excited I was when Northern Chaos Gods was announced, and I think it absolutely met expectations, despite Abbath's absence. There are many notable things about this album in terms of its sound. The most obvious thing to point out is the vocals. Interestingly, despite having performed vocals on his own solo album, Demonaz's vocal style here is very different from both Abbath's and what he used on that solo album. There are similarities to Abbath's sound from his time in Immortal, but Demonaz's voice is notably raspier and a little closer to the traditional black metal vocals one might expect. This, on top of some more intense instrumentation, makes Northern Chaos Gods a more blistering and aggressive album than Immortal's previous few albums. It really evokes more of the feeling that albums like Pure Holocaust or Blizzard Beasts have, rather than the likes of At the Heart of Winter or Sons of Northern Darkness. The style of guitar riffs is noticeably different as well, using a style much more in line with Demonaz's solo album than the material Abbath wrote in Immortal or his own solo work. There are a number of notable tracks on this album. The title track, which both opens the album and was the first piece of music we ever heard from this new iteration of Immortal, is arguably faster and more aggressive than anything the band had released since Pure Holocaust, using blisteringly fast blast beats and relentless riffs. Into Battle Ride sounds pretty reminiscent of something off Sons of Northern Darkness due to its dynamic sound and structure. Gates to Blashirk and Where Mountains Rise are a little more moderately paced and evoke something more like the sound of At the Heart of Winter. The same could be said of the closer Mighty Ravendark, which is the epic track of the album, and manages the feat of being the longest Immortal song ever released up to this point. This isn't quite a personal favorite for me when it comes to this band's discography, but is a very strong album, and an excellent comeback. Almost exactly a year later, in summer of 2019, we would receive the second album from Abbath's solo project, titled Outstrider. This album brought quite a shakeup for the band's lineup, which was a complete change aside from Abbath himself. He would bring in Ola Andre Farstad on guitar, Mia Wallace on bass, and Yukri Suviletto on drums. I apologize if I butchered those names, by the way. This is, in my opinion, an even stronger album than the debut Abbath album. There's a noticeably more dynamic feeling to Outstrider that allows each song to feel unique in some way, alongside a much heavier emphasis on atmospheric moments and lead guitar melodies. This album also feels larger than life, in a way that the debut didn't quite capture. I also have to lend particular praise to Abbath's vocal performance, as his vocals on this album are noticeably raspier and harsher than usual, which gives this album an even greater sense of unique identity. I can't say whether or not he heard or took influence from the Demonaz iteration of Immortal, but his voice on this album sounds almost like a combination of his usual style and Demonaz's vocals on Northern Chaos Gods, and it sounds fantastic. This album is chock full of excellent songs, including some of my absolute favorites I'll be covering in this video. This would include the title track, quite possibly my favorite song Abbath has ever written up to this point. I also love the opener, Calm and Ire of Hurricane, which sets itself apart through its lack of traditional verse-chorus song structure and features some amazing performances and writing across the board. Funnily enough, this could very well be my second favorite song Abbath has written. Other songs here are fantastic as well. Bridge of Spasms is fast and thrashy in places, and also features unique vocals from Abbath that almost sound like throat singing. Scythewinder is the standout Immortal-like track on the album, at least to my ear, sounding like it could have come off Damned in Black or Sons of Northern Darkness. Others like The Artifacts and Harvest Pyre are just really solid black metal songs with great riffs. This album in general is a great one for riffs, actually. Outstrider ends with a cover of Bathory's Pace Till Death, continuing the now established tradition of Abbath albums including a cover. This is an excellent album with a bunch of fantastic songs, and some of my favorite songs from any album in this video, making this one of my personal favorite albums I'm covering here. This brings us to the most recent album from Abbath's solo project at this time, Reaver. Although I wouldn't be surprised if we get a new one soon after this video's release, since these albums all have had 3-year gaps. When this album released in 2022, I actually had expected Immortal to be the first band to release a new album, so seeing Abbath beat them to the punch was a bit surprising. No major changes for the band in this one, aside from Mia Wallace having left for a time and returning for this album cycle, before leaving again shortly after. Aside from Damned in Black, this is probably the album in this video that most benefited from a re-listen for me. I was honestly kinda disappointed by it at first, and thought it was a big step down from the first 2 Abbath albums. I still think it's the weakest of the 3, but it is still a very good album. Reaver continues Abbath's trajectory of expanding the sound of this project, moving further into a black and roll style reminiscent of Eyes Between Two Worlds, although this still has plenty of traditional black metal influence, more so than that album did. This is due to both the more heavy metal style of riffs and drumming, as opposed to straight black metal, in addition to Abbath including a little more melody in his vocals like he did on Between Two Worlds. The evolution of Abbath's vocal style is really impressive on this album, easily making it his most vocally dynamic album yet. Reaver has a lot of great songs on it from beginning to end. One of my favorites is the opener, Acid Haze, which has some great riffs and a pretty catchy and memorable chorus. Scarred Core brings in some more of the black and roll stylings with a slightly different riffing style and some borderline clean melodic vocals from Abbath, although still done in his unique style. Myrmidon has sections reminiscent of a band like Motorhead, while The Deep Unbound is a pure black metal track that wouldn't have felt too out of place on the first Abbath album. Dream Call is noticeably darker than others on this album as well, making it stand out. For this album's cover song, Abbath went with a rendition of Metallica's Trapped Under Ice, which works pretty well for the more old-school metal approach of this album, and makes sense given the thrash elements Abbath liked to write with at times. Like I said earlier, this is probably my least favorite of the 3 Abbath albums so far, but it is still a really enjoyable one, especially if you've been waiting for another black and roll sort of album like Between Two Worlds. And that brings us to 2023, and the last album I'll be discussing in this video. Despite it not being as long as previous breaks between Immortal albums, it was a long 5-year wait between Northern Chaos Gods and War Against All. This was likely due in part to more behind-the-scenes drama with the band, and yet another legal dispute over the Immortal name. This led to longtime drummer Horg leaving the band, which left Demonaz as the sole member of Immortal. With the state of the band being what it is now, I have to say it's pretty fascinating to think of how much has changed across the band's lifespan. You had Demonaz initially leaving in the mid-90s due to acute tendinitis, but still providing lyrics and being involved in the band. Then the band split up, returned, and split again with the departure of Abbath, basically the face of Immortal. Then with Demonaz taking the lead in the band, we had this interesting new iteration that only remained stable for a single album cycle until it basically became another solo project. It's just really interesting to see the evolution of this band over time, and how different it is now compared to where it started. Getting back to the album, you had Demonaz writing music along with performing vocals and guitar, and then session musicians Ice Dale, who you may remember played on Eyes Between Two Worlds and Demonaz's solo album as well, on bass, and Kevin Cavall on drums. Sonically, this album is very similar to Northern Chaos Gods, but perhaps a bit more dynamic and melodic. It definitely sticks closer to that album than previous Immortal material, very clearly giving it a more modern Immortal identity. The title track, War Against All, begins the album very similarly to the last album's title track, with a blisteringly fast and aggressive black metal track harkening back to the days of pure Holocaust, truly fitting the name of the song. Thunders of Darkness continues that sense of intensity, while War God slows things down for a more anthemic track reminiscent of Immortal's classic song Tyrants. No Sun goes for a pretty traditional black metal sound, while Return to Cold employs a more old-school Immortal style somewhat reminiscent of At the Heart of Winter. Then the album throws a curveball at the listener with what I believe is the first ever instrumental track from Immortal, Nordlandir, which is coincidentally my favorite track on the album. I love how dynamic the song is, and the lack of vocals really allows the melodic guitar leads and riffs to drive the song. War Against All follows this up with another surprise. 3 decades into the band's career, we get a song called Immortal, and it's a really solid track. The album ends with the epic Blashirk My Throne, closing the album on a high note. This album is about on par with Northern Chaos Gods for me, not being a favorite Immortal album, but certainly including a couple of favorite songs. Between these two albums of the current era, I think it's safe to say Immortal is in safe hands for now, despite their chaotic membership history. We finally arrived at the end of this retrospective. I have to say it's been a lot of fun going back through Immortal's discography again, and really seeing the evolution of the band over time. While I haven't loved every album I've covered in this video, I have really enjoyed the vast majority of them, making Immortal and its various spin-offs one of the most consistently enjoyable metal bands out there, in my opinion. Not only is just about every album an enjoyable listen, but all of them have something unique to offer to the listener. Immortal is one of those bands that, while they've certainly had a well-established sound across the different eras of their career, never quite dipped into repetition and just releasing the same album over and over. Each one brings something fresh and new to the table, while still staying true to what makes Immortal, Immortal. On top of that, going through the 5 extra albums from Demonaz, and Abbath really showcases the unique styles that these 2 primary Immortal songwriters have, and the ways in which they brought those influences to the band. If you're a fan of Immortal and haven't given these other albums a try, I would highly recommend doing so. If you ask me, they all stand up right alongside the best of Immortal's work. I think undertaking this project has helped to give me a renewed appreciation for Immortal. They were a band that got me into black metal and have remained a favorite ever since, so I've always appreciated them on some level, but really digging into the evolution of their sound and looking at each album in more depth really showed me how unique, interesting, and impactful this band is. Well, that's about all I've got for this retrospective. I hope you've enjoyed taking a look at the career of Immortal with me. Let me know in the comments what you think of them, any favorite songs, albums, or memories you have relating to the band. I've been planning more videos like this, so if you enjoyed this one and are interested in more like it, subscribe to my channel and keep a lookout for future episodes of Discog Dive. Thank you for watching.